It's my pleasure now to introduce our second speaker for this session, Dr. Patricia Ordóñez. Patricia is a PhD and an associate professor in the computer science faculty at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. Her research interests are in applying machine learning, data mining, and visualization to multivariate time series analysis, specifically to large repositories of clinical data. She also founded the Symposium of Health Informatics for Latin America and the Caribbean, and she's passionate about making quality health and education accessible to all. The title of Dr. Ordóñez's talk today is The Importance of Design Thinking and Data Science Post-Hurricane Maria. And thank you so much, Patricia, for joining us today, and please take it away.
Hi, my name is Patricia Ordez Franco. I'm an associate professor of the Department of Computer Science at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. I'm also co-chair for the Diversion and Inclusion Council of the ACM, and I'm really honored to be here. So to begin with, so that we're all speaking the same things, I'm going to talk about what is design thinking versus what is data science. Design thinking is basically a process to develop a good user interface for ideas to solve problems. So typically the first part consists of trying to figure out how to interface with the user and how to empathize with the user that is of your application or your app. And it's typically then you go, after you empathize with that, then you define the problem and you get really specifically into defining the problem before you go on to brainstorm and ideate about how to solve that problem. And typically in this session, you're just throwing out ideas, crazy, doesn't matter, no no's, and you're just putting them out there. And finally, from those ideas, you iterate, come up with a solution, build a prototype, and at the end you test it. And what I try to show about this process is that you go back, like after you test, you can go back to the prototype. You could go back to the brainstorm idea. If you can't brainstorm, maybe you have to go back to defining the problem. And typically, this whole process would be something that would be really good to inject into data science. So when I think of data science, I typically think, okay, I have a hypothesis, I gather the data, and then wrangle it to try and get the information that I need and the features, etc. Then I do some data exploration, typically with visualization, maybe some unsupervised learning, and then I finally go to do data modeling, machine learning, and implement. Once I do that, then I test and I validate, and then I go forward between this data modeling and test and validation until I get, kind of something that proves or disproves the hypothesis. So the idea here is perhaps we could do better data science if we start injecting this process into design thinking into more layers of this data science process. And I'm going to give you an example of a story from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria to prove it, and then just prove the power of data science, to the capability of data science to empower people. So on September 20th, 2017, Hurricane Maria landed in Puerto Rico. It was Category 5, and you can notice it's Category 5 by how, circular that center is. That's an indication often of how the eye of the storm. If it's very circular, then it's typically very strong and going very quickly. And then you'll see that as it approaches, it kind of gets all scattered, and that's typically a sign of it slowing down. So it's Category 4. And what happens is that as soon as it hit, which is what you see right now, all the electricity on the island went out. It was basically the infrastructure was weakened from Hurricane Irma that it hit like 3 weeks earlier, and now this hurricane just totally devastated it. So this is a picture. By the way, that picture was a reflective radar, which is basically showing precipitation. And basically it turned more red as it hit the island. And I say that because when you see the pictures, you'll understand that concept of precipitation. Here, this is actually a satellite image that predicts heat. And I use this because this was also the last satellite image that came from the systems in Puerto Rico. And you'll notice that now at this point it was more circular. So there's a belief, and because of the devastation that it caused, there's a belief that it was Category 5. To be Category 5, it actually has to be measured, the miles per hour, the maximum wind gust has to be maintained for a minute. And so there were definitely parts where it was 155, but the maximum for a minute on the island before the electricity went out, nowhere did it show that it was 155. But basically, I'm working with NOAA when doing this with one of the weather one of the weather's lead of the weather station in Puerto Rico, and he basically everyone thinks that it was Category 5 because of the devastation. There are people that have lived on the island and say this was the most horrific hurricane that had landed. But they can't say that because they have to actually look at the structural damage of now because the electricity went out. Now I just want to show you how it looked. So here, this is Rio Grande. This is where it came in, and it entered into Puerto Rico. This is like the farmland of Puerto Rico, and you'll see how everything turned brown. That's the amount of water that just flooded these lands. In the mountains, it was much higher, and I'm going to show you next Utuado. And Utuado was probably the region that was hardest hit and where I had the most landslides in the count in this country. And you'll see the difference here and the width of what was left over. These were actually pictures taken by drones after the day after that. They still had electricity. Here is another part in the mountains. This is like the mountains in like the southeast, and this is Villalba. And I just showed you this again because this was again one of the ones that was hardest hit. You'll see everything normally in Puerto Rico is green, and when I went back in 2017, that I went back in December, everything was at that point brown. And it's funny because I was in California at that time when all the fires were going out. I was doing actually an internship with a big tech company there and also with a nonprofit. And so here, I just want to show you the bright red shows less than 25 landslides per square kilometer. And then the dark red ones, and you see that the dark red one in the center, that is Utuado, the picture that I showed you where the greatest devastation happened. And you'll see that there's little patches of those where they had more than 25 landslides per square kilometer. And those were the hardest hit. Those were basically the places where there was starvation and lack of water and no electricity. And these basically are the regions that basically did not have electricity for a year, and some of them still may not have. What does it look like on the ground? Well, this is Barranquitas, another mountain town, and you'll see that basically what happened, this happened at intersections a lot. There's a road from coming down the mountain, which made for water easily to come down, hits another road that's at the crossroads, and those were completely wiped out. Here is Utuado. This is what it looked like. And most of Puerto Rico looked like this. You remember the Green Lush. It was basically, you saw places where there were landslides. You saw places, homes that were devastated. You saw basically all the trees had no leaves. And I showed you this in particular because this was one of the hardest hit regions, as I said. And I just want to show this because this is what happened. The people of Puerto Rico came through, and this is a picture from, not necessarily from this article, but this is an article that talked about the creativeness of the people when there wasn't help coming, how they started to help one another and how creative they got. This in particular, this bridge is the same one that I showed you before, and there was no way to get across. There was no way to bring supplies. There were no roads to take it to the people. So what did they do? They basically created a pulley on a tree on the opposite side. They took a shopping cart and basically let gravity take it down to the bridge, and then from the bridge down to the road to be restacked and come up. I show you this because the $92 billion has not yet arrived in Puerto Rico, and we're already 5 years into it. And so it's called, if you notice the title of this, the Campamento Los Olvidados. It means the camp of the forgotten. And so this is a story of how these people became empowered. So I want to talk about the importance of good data, scientific communication, and interdisciplinary and inter-university collaboration. It's a story about Carolyn Buckey from the Department of Epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She also is the associate director for the Center of, for the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics. And then we have here Professor Rafael Irizarry from the Department of Biostatistics at the same Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, but he's also in the Applied Statistics at Harvard University. And he's also the director of the Department of Data Science at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. So basically, this is a story where Caroline Buckey was doing research over on the island, and she couldn't get in touch with a lot of her collaborators. And the ones that she did, and then people were saying that the devastation was far greater than what was being heard at the on the news. I was actually posting on Facebook how great it was that the numbers were so low, that the death count was only 16, and I was like, what a fantastic job. And then my friends started saying, Patty, everyone knows that that's wrong. Everyone knows that it's lying, and I couldn't believe it. But as things started coming out, more things happened. So on October 23rd, Dr. Buckey actually contacts Dr. Irizarry, and they decide to start trying to see if they're about designing a survey and whether they would do a survey to try and get the correct answers. November 8th, and they also tried to get the data. That was one of the things. This is basically a story about how these two top-notch professors, leaders in their field, were not able to get data about the mortality deaths. But finally, November 8th, New York Times publishes an article where they had started interviewing people on funeral home data. And they actually did get a number for September. And they found out that the number of the mortality was 472 from the previous year. And that came actually from the registry, the demographics, the registry of human statistics for Puerto Rico, the equivalent of that. Then November 20th, CNN does also a study on funeral home data, and they predict it's about 499 people that had died more than, or about 499 people had died after the hurricane. Penn State then goes on, and they have actually the mortality data that is being denied these researchers for September and October, and they estimate that their predictions from those 2 months that there's probably 1,000 have died due to Hurricane Maria. And then finally, December 5th, this team decides to design a survey. And so they basically go out and try to collaborate, find people on the island who could go out and, go to, basically they went to 20 towns and went door to door looking at towns that have, different socioeconomic levels. And they interviewed like more than 3,100 homes to find out how many people from them had done the had died, how many families had died as a result of the hurricane. Then what happens is there's on December 7th, another, this Centro de Periodismo Investigativo is like a group in Puerto Rico that does research on the island. They also estimated approximately 1,000 for September and October. Finally, the New York Times comes out again with another article, and they estimate about 1,052. And they have the daily data. He notices that they have the daily data. So again, they start asking for the data, and it's being denied. And so what happens at this point, December 13th, the Public Security Secretary says that these estimates are wrong. The official death, they did move it up. It's now 55, and they have all laid out the different ways that they did. But due to Hurricane Maria, it's only 55. Now, so what did they do? They started to do, innovative data science and using design thinking. They started, scraping data from there was another Penn State publication, and they basically started scraping that data and comparing it to the previous years that they could get from 2010 to 2016. And it was really evident that something was really wrong for September and October. Anyway, so then they go on to the New York Times data. They get the data from the New York Times, but it's in a PDF, and they do an exercise and they get the data and they still see, but there is missing data. And a lot of this missing data for November and December is basically because the bodies were without electricity. The morgue was going slow. There were only 2 pathologists that were working on this, and basically the bodies were piling up. Here, the February 28th, the Puerto Rico Institute of Statistics has data, and there's missing data as a result of, they have up to November, but there's this belief of what's going on with what's happening here. And again, because it's the official data and there's no electricity, it's, things are very logged behind. I have a friend of mine whose husband died, and it was a year before that death certificate went through. So what did they do? How can they estimate the death toll? They basically decided to estimate it by looking at the percentage of deaths in these homes, and using percentage of death to estimate the population, and multiplying by the estimate of the population to get, what the mortality count. This required interdisciplinary collaboration. They went to everywhere, and they finally found this professor from the Albizu University in Viejo San Juan. And this, basically, it was a psychology professor, and they were doing interviews with people, trying to find out, the state of mental health. And so it was basically adding to these surveys so that they could actually get an estimate. So let's talk about what they did. After scraping the data from the New York Times, what did they do? They took this increased rate of mortality, looked at seasonal effects and the population estimate. And basically what they did was compare that projection from the mortality of the past years. By May 25th, 29th, the official death toll for Hurricane Maria is 64. The Harvard team that same day publishes an estimate of approximately 5,000 in the New England Journal of Medicine. June 1st, the governor is interviewed by Anderson Cooper on CNN, and he says they'll be held to pay if anybody is denying the data. And so then finally, the government makes the data public. And I show you this because there's where good communication, good journalism, good, resources, all this had to come together to make this possible. And I show you this link at the bottom because if you guys want to see all these articles, this is a link of the blog of Dr. Abrasiary. He has all the information there. Here's the actual paper that came out. You'll see that Caroline Buckey is the last author, and basically the lead for this author. And you'll also see all the people that were cited and all the different disciplines: psychology, medical doctors, public health doctors, PhDs in statistics. It's just, it needs that type of collaboration to tackle something so big. And in this case, the problem, was the lack of trying to get that correct number, trying to find a more correct approximation. Now, as they were doing this, they were really scared of people just taking that number. So they tried to show the standard of deviation, because with such a small sample size, the standard of deviation would be huge. But that number made it through to the communications in the newspaper in Puerto Rico and led to empowering a lot of people. This is in July. So once that happened, then chats of the governor came out where it was very evident that he knew that he was retaining, that there was something really wrong. There was, a lot of, the chat was very distasteful. And to the point mocking the number of deaths that were happening to Hurricane Maria. And honestly, I think that was there were the typical things that you see from politicians nowadays, but I think that point in particular made the case. And I say that because what happened is that when that number came out, people started taking shoes to the Capitol and put the number 4645 on, so that number had such great significance. People were wearing it everywhere. They were putting it on banners, they were putting it on their chest. That number really changed the whole thing. And I just said I wanted to show this because I wanted to show you that people that go through something like this have incredible resilience, incredible creativity, And so it was, on the island. This was actually this is a picture I took, the one in the middle. This was actually during the protests that they basically climbed out. Like that was one of the major highways of Puerto Rico, and a third of the population walked out on it. Then the artists started, and the dancers started going into different parts and doing creative photography. And then even somebody put, there's the black banner for Puerto Rico became kind of the motto, and they actually put it on the little girl on Wall Street. And here, you guys know this, more data, more obvious. So here it shows basically like what they were doing for 1 year versus what they did for several years. And it's very evident from the second part that this effect of people dying from Hurricane Maria actually went all the way until July 2018. And so it's just showing the effects of not getting that assistance. One of the great things he did was he put all this on GitHub. So I use this actually in my class to motivate people to learn data science. They also created a package to help with this. So this is the excess mort that you see down there. That's a package. So if you want to use it for your classes, I think it's a great thing to do. So on obtaining the data, so once the data was public, what did they do? They compared the merger, because now at this point, people were saying, oh, well, what happened in Puerto Rico wasn't as bad as what happened in Texas and what happened in Florida. So they started to compare the mortality rate of Hurricane Maria to other storms. They basically, on June 8th, came out with a new, and posted a new statistical analysis with the new data, which is what I showed you. On August 27th, the George Washington University comes out with a preliminary estimate of 3,000 deaths, right? So June 8th, you have the 4,648 deaths, and then GW comes with approximately 3,000 deaths. Then they did the new, once they got the data in June, they started doing all these other, the analysis that I talked about, and they have a preprint of the analysis of what was going to be printed here. And so it shows you that the hurricane, basically they had come up with a new number that also estimated approximately 3,000, therefore reinforcing what had happened with the GW story. Here's one of the images there. So he looked at the percent in change of mortality. And so he compared it to what happened in Puerto Rico for Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Georges, and Hurricane Hugo, compared it to what happened in Louisiana with Katrina, what happened in New Jersey with Sandy, and what happened in Florida with Irma. And you can see from here that these really, these numbers definitely show that the percentage of death in Puerto Rico increased drastically by 75% for Hurricane Maria. And there's a history of this. So it was just kind of further accentuating that what is happening in Puerto Rico was really a humanitarian crisis. Here he's showing excess deaths for Katrina, Georges also. They posted it, and then a standard deviation, and just showing how much longer the effects were from Puerto Rico as a result of not getting assistance. Finally, the publication got to Puerto Rico in March of 2019, just showing you that I'm so glad for preprints. So takeaways: tough problems require both design thinking and design data science, but it also requires mutually beneficial inter-university collaboration with reputable universities. So I say this to you because anything that you do with a minority serving institution or a rural institution, any collaboration you do, like if you are taking students from those universities, you should also try to do some sort of education, because now the digital and data divide 5.2 among universities and communities is greater than anything that I've ever seen. I have lived this downfall that you see here on the right. When I arrived at Rio Piedras in 2020, for these predictions come 2 years later. So in 2012, I find out what happened in 2010, and we found out we were #1 for the country. In 2011, we were #1 for the country in producing Hispanic PhDs in STEM, and then in 2012. But all those came like from 2012 to 2014. So my first 3 years in Puerto Rico, we were #1 Hispanic producing we were the #1 U.S. institution for producing Hispanic PhDs in STEM and engineering. Although our focus is more STEM than engineering. And look at this decline. It's just incredible. So if you look at 2014 is really 2016 when the data came out. And just the decline is incredible. So this 2016, what happened in Puerto Rico was basically the crisis of the economic crisis, where basically a fiscal control board was placed in Puerto Rico. And now in 2019, we are off. We're not in the top 20 anymore. So it's a data and digital divide, but it's also an economy divide because of the digital and data divide among universities. We really need to tackle this. The next thing, numbers matter. I showed you that. And also we need to get design thinking and data science for all. Everybody needs to know this. I really think it would cure so many of the ills that we have in our society, because right now people can just fake science, but this way they won't be able to. Finally, I want to acknowledge the people that helped me: Rafael Rizarri, professor in the bio, that I've already mentioned, and Carlos Alceni Molina. He was the lead forecaster for the National Weather Service in Puerto Rico. And I'm ready. Here you have my email and my Twitter, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here.